morning. For those who don't know me, I'm Lily Faye Kramer, and I'm a junior. I'm Jewish and have attended Catholic schools most of my life, which gives me a neat perspective on the Holocaust. Some of my ancestors died during the Holocaust, but some found freedom in the U.S. I feel that it is my duty to share their stories and provide a platform for other survivors in hopes to prevent history from repeating itself and to help people remember that this tragedy did not happen overnight. For my Girl Scout Gold Award, I am honored to be working with the Tennessee Holocaust Commission to bring our guest speaker today, Ms. Marion Weinzweig, to Nashville schools during this week of Holocaust Remembrance. We are extremely fortunate to have Marion here today because this is our last generation of Holocaust survivors. I would like to thank Alyssa Trackman and the Tennessee Holocaust Commission for their help and support for making this possible. Marion Weinzweig was born in Poland in 1941. At 18 months old, her family sent her into hiding with a Christian family who would later send Marion to a convent where she would be raised Catholic by nuns during her stay. The rest she will tell. Marion says, "My greatest hope is that by sharing my story, I can help others come forward and speak up for what is right." Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Marion Weinzweig.
Thank you so very much for inviting me to your incredibly beautiful school. I feel so very privileged to be here today because I spent my early life hiding from the Germans in a Catholic convent. It was called the Order of Sisters in the Name of Jesus. I don't know if you're familiar with it. So thanks to that convent, I am here today. I'm alive because of them. So I don't know if you know that actually 1,500,000 Jewish children up to the age of 16 were murdered by the Germans and their cohorts during World War II. And it's so important for me to share my life with you now because of the horrible anti-Semitism and Jew hatred that, would you believe, is almost as high as it was just before the Holocaust. And it's so interesting because today is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, where Russia, who at that time was of course our ally, liberated Auschwitz. But for my family, it was not liberation because 10 days before that happened, before it was liberated, my father and my aunt and uncle, they were taken by the Germans on a death march. My father and uncle to Buchenwald and my aunt to Bergen-Belsen. But I'll tell you about that later. But it's interesting. You know, Holocaust remembrance is not, for me, certainly not January the 27th. Anyhow, I'll get right to my story. So Germany invaded Poland in 1939. And it was the very first country that the Germans captured. Now, on the second day after they entered our town, they burned down the complete market square that was Jewish, as well as all the houses around it, which were mostly owned by Jews. After that, the Germans took away our civil liberties. Students were thrown out from all schools, from universities. Our teachers were hauled off to concentration camps, and you know, we weren't even allowed to own any pets, no dogs or cats. Then we were forced to hand over all of our valuables to the Germans. It's hard to believe. And then after that, curfews were enforced, and no Jews were allowed to walk on the streets. And of course, we were forbidden to leave the country. It was totally closed off. So by 1940, Jews were forced to wear white armbands with blue stars of David in order to identify us as Jews at all times. You know, if you were caught without your armband, you could actually be shot. And it's funny too, because Not only did Germans force us to wear these armbands, but they made us pay 2 zlotys for each armband. So this is what I was born into. I was born in Opatów, Poland in January of 1941, and us Jews called it out. I've always called it out. And my parents never registered my birth, and 2 months later the Germans found out that I was born. Well, you know why they didn't register my birth. They didn't want me to be known. And then when they found out about me, then my father had to go down to City Hall and register my birth, and then after that he had to write a big lie as to why it took so long. I have that documentation, by the way, which is very interesting. Anyhow, the ghetto was established in the spring of 1941, and at that time I was about 4 months old. My name was Marion Steinman, and luckily I am one of 2 very small children that actually survived, from Abt. We had very good relations with the Poles, and that's my father there, and he served in the Polish Army in 1933. And, Jews had lived in Abt since the 1600s, the early 1600s. And my mother, she came from Lublin, which was the 3rd largest city in Poland. You could see that's when they were dating my mother and father. And it's on a street in Lublin. And a third of the population there, they were Jews. And it was a very, very cosmopolitan city, as you can see from that picture. But she moved to Abt when she married my father in April of 1940. And that's my mother. My computer shows it to the far right. Is that how you see it too? And she's got the flowers, and my father's next to her. And then there's all the, my father's 2 sisters and his younger brother. Everybody in that picture was murdered, except, thank God, for my father. Anyhow, after they were married, would you believe that 9 months later I was born? And I'm sure that must have been the last thing that my parents wanted at this really horrific time, to bring a life into the world. But there I was. So the only language that was ever spoken in our home before I was born was Yiddish. And Yiddish is the Jewish language. But from the very moment I was born, not another word of Yiddish was ever spoken near me. Only Polish. And of course the reason for this was because my family felt that if things got really bad and they had to give me up, they would have to hide me as a Christian. And if I didn't understand Yiddish, then I wouldn't give myself away. So when the war started, excuse me, I need a drink. So when the war started, the Jewish population of Abt was about 5,200 Jews, but it grew to way over 7,200 because of the influx of Jews from other towns and cities trying to find a safer place that they thought in smaller towns. But on top of that, the Germans also deported Jews all the way from Vienna and also Czechoslovakia into our ghetto. And we were completely boxed in because Germany had closed all the borders around Poland, and we couldn't run anywhere to safety. And people were scurrying around like rats within Poland, just trying to find a safer place to survive. So our ghetto had over 7,200 people, and when I've done the research, they've even said up to 10,000. But it occupied only 2 city blocks of houses and a few alleyways. And I don't know if you can imagine how awful it was because of the overcrowding and the unspeakable sanitary conditions and also starvation. There was a horrific outbreak of typhus in the ghetto. Now, the only good thing about it was that the Germans were very afraid of the typhus, so at that point they didn't come into our ghetto, which was great. but people were just dying like flies from disease and starvation. And the Jews in Abt were forced into slave labor, and what can I say, they were beaten and they were terrorized, and then of course they became demoralized. They were slaves cleaning streets and building roads and working in rock quarries, and if they didn't work fast enough or if they sat down for a moment, and they were whipped by the guards. And then women, of course, were supplied to the Germans. Women and also children, girls over the age of 12, were supplied to the Germans for their domestic needs. And every single night you heard shooting coming from the Jewish cemetery. And what that was were people were picked up randomly, those that disobeyed curfews, those that weren't wearing their stars, those that talked back, God forbid, and young people, especially if they saw little children, and also old people and people that looked sickly. They were all gathered throughout the day, and at night they were taken out to the Jewish cemetery and shot. So one time there was a group of Jews, Jewish men. They tried to accumulate weapons in order to fight back, and they bought the weapons from the Polish underground. And where would they hide them? Of course, in the Jewish mikveh, which I told you was the Jewish ritual bath. I think I told you that. But anyway, somehow the Germans found out about it, and they raided the mikveh, and there was a bunch of young girls just hanging out there. They were, young teenagers, and when they found the weapons, they were just so incensed that they just shot all the girls. And after that, they went on a rampage throughout the ghetto, knocking down doors and shooting people that were in their way, to see if they could find more weapons. So that's what life was like in our town of Abt. So in January of 1942, the Germans held their Wannsee conference. I don't know if you've heard about it. You probably have. And it was in a mansion in the suburbs of Berlin. And it was to implement their final solution. Interestingly enough, the 15 men, one of them was Adolf Eichmann. I'm sorry to say that among them, I don't quite remember, but I think there were about 7 PhDs and a lot of lawyers and some judges. And they actually implemented, their agenda was to strategize how to most efficiently murder the entire Jewish people. Would you believe that it took them less than an hour and a half to finalize it? I've been to Wannsee, I've seen it all. And then after that, they went out and they had a very nice lunch. So with that being approved, they constructed their very first mass murder center, which was called Belzec. They started constructing it actually in the fall of 1941, but after it was approved in mid-March of 1942, they murdered most of the Jews. No, wait a second. I didn't show you this. Okay, so that was me. You see my father's wearing an armband, and probably it was no more than a month before I was taken away. So that was in our town. But in mid-March of 1942, they murdered most of the Jews from Lublin there. That's what I want to show you. This is a picture of my mother. She's in the middle. Now, she was murdered in this massacre, but there's her mother's there, her little brother, her sisters, and having a nice celebration. and everybody was murdered there in Belzec. It's hard for me to even talk about it, but just everybody. But prior to Belzec, German armed forces, they were called Einsatzgruppen, and they carried out most of the mass murders of the Jews just by shooting them. And it was very, very inefficient. They found out, and it also didn't kill people fast enough. They needed the bullets for, for the war effort. So that's when, they lined up people and just shot them. Sometimes just, I won't go into it. But sometimes ditches were dug, and that's especially the Ukraine. And then they put a board across the big ditch, and they used to make maybe 10 Jews or whatever. I'm talking about little children as well. Just walk along that the boards, and then they were just shot, and they just didn't even have to bother burying them because they fell into the pits. Then they'd get the next few, and yeah, it was really, really horrible. But anyways, it just didn't kill people fast enough. So then they transitioned to mobile gas vans, which they were called Sonderwagens. And what they do was they'd load about 50 victims into a van, smaller than your school buses. And it was airtight, and the doors were locked. And then when the driver started the motor, the exhaust gas was piped in into the main cabin while the engine was running, and it produced carbon monoxide to suffocate everyone. And by the time the driver pulled up to the pits where they were going to be buried, everybody was already dead. So, but anyways, they decided that too was slow and inefficient. Gosh, if you want to murder, because they were talking about murdering all the Jews of Europe as well as England. So they had 11 million Jews that they were going to murder. So of course they had to do something much bigger. So that's when they went to buildings where they could kill lots of people fast. So that's okay. I've still got that picture up there. So that's where the gas chambers came in. And the first one, like I said, was Belzec, and my mother's family, they just died horrible deaths there in these huge chambers that were labeled as showers, and they sealed the doors, and carbon monoxide was funneled in through hoses to the chambers. So that's what happened to my mother's side of the family in Lublin. Then in Upt, my grandfather and my father were wheat and flour merchants, and had very good relations with some of the Polish landowners, because back then you had to rent your piece of land, the piece of land that you were growing wheat from the landowners. So eventually, rumors started that the Jews were going to be sent east. And my family speculated that this was not a good thing for us. Several men had escaped from trains that were going east, and they came through Upt, and they were telling horror stories about what was going on there. Excuse me. So my family worried about me. I was the first grandchild to actually both sets of grandparents. My father had 4 sisters, 3 brothers. My mother had 2 sisters and a little brother. So there was a lot of family, and I was the very first grandchild. So of course they were worried about me. And so my dad asked this landowner that he dealt with, his name was Pan is Mr. Repolowska, if he would take me until it was safe for me to come back. Now, his wife was undecided. whether she would. So she came to see me at my grandmother's, and you can see here, that's like about a month later. But I was a year and 9 months old, and of course I don't have any recollection of the following, but my aunt who was there at that time, and thank God she survived the war, told me about this many years later when I was an adult. She told me that was early in October of 1942, and she said that I was this beautiful toddler with big blue eyes and big dimples, and she said my aunt watched all this unfold, and she said everybody was nervous and as to whether I'd be taken by this lady, and she said it was so uncanny because it seemed as if though at the age of 1 year and 9 months, I somehow knew that my life depended on me impressing this lady. So I'd be sitting on my mother's lap, and then without a backward glance, I just got off of her lap and I waddled over to Mrs. Repolevska with a huge smile on my face, and my arms flung out to her, and she picked me up, and I sat on her knee. My mother saw that it was going to happen, and of course they were all very happy, but my mother turned back and she was just crying silently. This is what my aunt told me, who was there. So anyways, the next day, my parents snuck me out of the ghetto to like a pre-arranged area where the Repolevska's carriage driver was waiting there again. His name was Pan Mr. Jan, and he waited for me, and it was an area where there was horse and buggies, and my father took me up to the carriage, and my mother stood back crying. And I have to tell you that that's the last time I ever saw my mother again. So after I was given away, then my father and his brother and his brother's wife were looking for ways to try to save themselves. And the three of them, they snuck out of the ghetto, and they made their way to the city of Starkovitz, where my aunt had come from, and they became slave laborers in the munitions factory there. And of course, it's hard to understand that you wanted to be a slave, but if you were a slave, then you were some used to the Germans, so you had a chance of staying alive. And I don't know for sure, but I truly believe that my mother was just very depressed because 6 months earlier she knew that all her family was killed, and now she had to give up her baby, and she just didn't want to. She just didn't want to run with my father. She wanted to stay back with his family in Abt, and but my father told her that as soon as he finds a place that he thinks will be safer, he would call and find a way for her to join him. So before he became a slave in Starkovitz, he called to speak to my mother, and the telephone operator told him that Abt was Judenrein. Judenrein means that it was clean of Jews. So actually it was October the 20th of 1942. The Germans and the Ukrainians, they surrounded our ghetto, and they rounded up all of the Jews into this. I've seen it. I just recently, when I went to Abt, this area that was actually had been the Jewish market square, and then they carried out their mass selection, and they shot anyone that resisted, and then about 500 men were taken as slave laborers to Sandomierz. And also, they also left some men behind so that they would clean up after us, and also they knocked, they kicked in all the doors and looked for anything that the Jews might have left before the Germans left with us. Let's see here. Okay, so here. Now, so the rest of the people, there were 6,700 Jews. They were forced 11 miles, which it was 70 kilometers, but 70 kilometers is 11 miles, to the train station in Jaziz. And that's the train station. I was just there 3 months ago for the anniversary, would you believe the 80th anniversary of when everybody was taken to Treblinka. And what they did, they had to walk like from Abt, that was the nearest railway station, 17 kilometers away. Seeing that, I can't even tell you what it did to me, because here's also another picture from Jaziz that I took, and it's actually where they got on the rails, and it went directly to Treblinka. It was just uncanny. But in Jaziz, they were loaded onto cattle cars to Treblinka, and what's so interesting, if you could just imagine that Jews had lived in Abt since the 1600s, and it took the Germans only 3 days to get rid of every single Jew from there. This was the entrance to Treblinka. I took my daughter. This was like 11 years ago, because you can see I was much younger then. And I've gone about 3 times. Every time I go to Treblinka, I can't tell you, it is so beautiful, certainly coming into it. The air is so sweet, and the grass is so green, and birds are chirping, and I can't tell you how much I hate that beauty. It's just so scary, because to me it's the most evil place in the world. But so 120 people were packed into each boxcar with only 1 bucket for waste. And Treblinka was strictly a death camp. And they had these huge storerooms that the Germans housed the personal possessions of their victims. And actually, it was like they disguised it as a railway station, even with a big wooden cloth and a ticket counter, because they didn't want you to know what was happening. So these storerooms, they housed the personal possessions of their victims. So I have pictures of everything, but I didn't bring them with me. But it was eyeglasses, and of course they were always looking for gold from teeth, and because usually people at that time used gold for fillings, and hair that was made hair was so important because it was made into fabric, and was also used for upholstery. And of course, shoes, tons of shoes, suitcases, and everything was in separate storerooms, and it was all sent back to Germany for the German public. So, like I said, when they exited the trains and the Germans didn't want anybody to be alarmed, they just announced that they'd enter a transit camp, and everyone had to be deloused and showered, and that made sense. And so women and children were taken into a separate barrack, and men were taken into another one, and I think probably because they didn't want the men to interfere with what was happening to the women and children. And everybody was forced to undress, and they were told that they were going to the bathhouse to be cleaned and disinfected before going east. actually going east to start a new life there. And before you exited, you had to give all your valuables. You had to hand them over to the guards. And then after that, they were walked along this really beautiful path with flowers planted all along the way. And I guess that was probably to trick you to think that you were going, to get into a shower. And then you came to this big building with a huge Star of David at the top of the building. And but it was not a shower. It was a gas chamber. And once they got you close in, people started rebelling. Then they just they beat you to make you move along, and you were packed in like sardines, and then murdered with again carbon monoxide bundled into the chambers, and then you were cremated in the pits. Now, interestingly, from the time that you actually got off the train until you were no more, would you believe it was less than 2 hours? That's how efficient the Germans were at the time. And I guess the reason I just talk about Treblinka so much is that my mother was murdered there at the age of 25 years old. And of course, together with most of my father's family, my grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. Don't forget, we had lived there for so long. And of course, I was supposed to be with them. And I cheated death through the unselfishness of my parents actually giving me away. Most people kept their children with them. I'm alive today because they gave me away. So on the screen you see 17,000 stones. When they left Treblinka, they knew it was a horrific place. When the Germans closed it down, they murdered 900,000 Jews there. They demolished everything, they razed everything, but then Jewish communities from around the world put up stones. So on the screen, what you see is 17,000 stones commemorating the 900,000 victims whose final resting place is here. And then 216 of the stones bear the names of cities and towns from which all Jews were forced here. And let's see. So this is this is one of the 216 stones. So every community, every town, even Warsaw, they took their Jews to Treblinka, has a big monument, but every town is like that. But anyhow, you can see we light memorial candles, and this again was when I was in Treblinka, another time where I brought my 3 children. I think that was the second time I was in Treblinka. As you can see, I look a lot younger. So I went into hiding no more than 3 weeks before my mother was murdered. The Repolevskas, they gave me a Polish name. I became Marysia Repolevska, and then they told their neighbors that I was just a little niece visiting. But back then there was bounty on Jewish heads, and if you reported a Jew, then the Germans would reward you, probably with a little bit of sugar. And the neighbors, would you believe, they got suspicious when I didn't leave after a couple of weeks. I mean, I can't blame them for being suspicious. 1 year and 9 months old, and I'm wandering around there. They didn't believe I was a niece. So what they did was they reported me to the Germans, thinking, hey, maybe they're hiding a Jew. So one day the Gestapo actually knocks on our door, and would you believe that they came to interrogate me? And They never had problems checking out on Jewish boys because it just made them lower their pants, and all Jewish boys are circumcised. But of course, with girls it was very different. And by the way, that's why fewer Jewish boys survived than girls, because of the circumcision. But of course, girls were different, and the Gestapo was very, very well trained in speaking Yiddish, and they tried to trip me up by speaking Yiddish to me. They were looking for a look of recognition in my eyes or my facial expressions that I understood. But of course, I was totally blank because I only understood Polish, and so they left to check me out further, and the Repolovskas got so scared after that, because if you think about it, they could have been killed. They would have been killed if they were harboring a Jew. So they told their carriage driver, Jan, just to put me into his buggy, his carriage, and take me to another town, someplace where I couldn't be identified as being with them. So the carriage driver, he drove through several towns, and eventually he came to he saw a convent in the distance in the town of Klementov. So a convent was to the right, and to the left was a big church. And so what he did, he actually he took me out and he put me into this deep ditch, and then he just galloped off. And of course, I was screaming and crying when he left me. I was very scared. But what he did, he was very smart, because he rang the bell of the convent, and he told the nuns that he heard noises, possibly like crying, coming from the ditch, and they should go check it out. So when the nuns came and found me, that they thought that I was just a poor little Christian waif. Let's see, okay. So this is a synagogue in Klementov where I was. Would you believe it was just a block away from the convent, and they had a very big Jewish population there, about 4,000 Jews, and thank God they didn't destroy it, but they used it as storage. That was when I was there a bunch of years ago. And what they did actually was, it was just on October the 30th, which was just 10 days after the massacre in Ept. Again, Germans and Ukrainians, they surrounded Klementov, and they took all of the 4,000 Jews. They also to Treblinka. I guess they probably killed a lot of people too. So there, okay. So I was the littlest of all the children in the convent. You could see me. I'm the little thing in the wagon, and you really don't want to wind up in a convent in Poland, because it was really cold and unwelcoming, and the nuns were very, very strict, and food was scarce, and I had not known hunger before, but I guess I had trouble getting food, so I was always terribly hungry. I was always starving, and we slept in a barrack away from the main house, closer to the road, and it was very crowded. They didn't have much room for us, and our beds were just so close together. They were like sandwiches, and in order to get into bed and out of it, we had to climb in from the ends. And this is just an enlargement of me from the same picture. So after breakfast, we'd go across the street to the church, and we do little chores there, and we prayed, and we also cleaned off all the wax, and the church was dark. It was dark, and I was just such a little thing. It was scary to me, and I sort of became like a chameleon, just trying to blend into all the nooks and the crevices, and I tried not to call attention to myself, and I tried not to make much noise, and later I didn't cry much, and in recent years I learned that if you're in a lot of trauma, you don't cry. If you cry really loud, that means you're lucky. You're not being threatened. And I was always trying to be very, very pleasing. But to tell you the truth, I was so alone. I didn't have anybody to share my fears with. Nobody knew I was Jewish. And I certainly had nobody to touch or to put an arm around me. But after a time, I was baptized, and I became a fervent Catholic. I think I believed that being Christian was safe. Excuse me, I drink a lot of water when I'm nervous. Anyways, years later, we were all sleeping. It was very late at night. A German tank mistakenly bombed our convent, but the nuns still don't know why, but the barrack that I slept in took a direct hit. And it was, like I told you, very late at night, and the nuns rushed into our barrack, and they made us run over into this huge courtyard. Well, you know, I'm going to show you a picture. It wasn't so huge, but to me it was. Oh, this is when I was at the church just recently, and see, it still looks dark. In my old age, I still think it's dark. So we ran into this huge courtyard that wasn't huge, but that's how I remember it, with this big statue of the Virgin Mary. That's when I went back a bunch of years ago. And they of course, told us to kneel down and pray to the Virgin to save us. And we're all kneeling and praying, and you know, these horrible noises, and there's fire all around us, and we're praying to the Virgin. And then for some reason, I just jumped up and I started running, and I was tripping over bodies. I don't know if they were alive or dead. And I've gone back to the convent a few times, and I took my children to Clementov, a few years back, and the Mother Superior told us that they consider that night, and of course it wasn't the same Mother Superior, I mean, you know, she's not alive anymore, but they told us that they consider that night their second greatest miracle of all time. Of course, the first being Jesus, and the second, that all of us were saved. But in my nightmares, I certainly remember running all alone and tripping over bodies, and darkness and fire around me. Then when I tired from running, I was alone. I was all alone. That's how I remember in my head. And when I tired from running, I just fell asleep from exhaustion at the side of the road. And I do remember being all alone and very scared. And we had a few harrowing days that I won't go into, but eventually another convent in the town of Lagnieu took me in. So meanwhile, my father and his brother, my uncle and my aunt, they were slave laborers in the munitions factory in Starkovitz. And it was a very, very sadistic place because as the workers got weak or sick, they would just kill them off and bring in a fresh batch of Jews. So one time my father was selected to be killed, and he was taken out with about 50 others way out into a field, and the Germans just shot everybody and then they left. And my father was at the back of the group, and a bullet hit him right here, on the right side, about an inch from his eye, his forehead. And then others fell on top of him, and they absorbed all the other bullets. So of course he fainted, but in the middle of the night he wakes up and he pushed himself out from, would you believe, I don't know how he could do it, but he pushed himself out from under the dead bodies. And he somehow got into his barrack and he dealt with his wounds. Then his brother, my uncle, he got typhus. And of course the Germans sent him to the sick barrack, their hospital. He didn't want to go, but he had no choice because he knew that every single night the guards would come in, and once the barrack was completely filled, and take out everybody and just kill them in the woods. So in that way they had a fresh barrack to start all over the next day. So that night he didn't sleep and he tried to get a bed closer to the window, and he kept listening for the guards. And then just before they came in, he heard them. He crawled out of the window and he hung on to the windowsill on the outside until all the people were taken. Then when the coast was clear, he hoisted himself back in, and he snuck back into his old barrack and he dealt with his typhus. Now, the reason I tell you all this is I want you to realize that it wasn't pure luck that saved us. We were also very proactive in surviving. And my sainted aunt, she unfortunately came into Starkovitz pregnant, and she was able to hide her pregnancy while she was on the assembly line making bullets. So months later, when the baby came, she had it in the barrack by herself with the inmates helping her. And she had a beautiful little baby girl. And when the guards came in and they saw a newborn baby, I mean, they just couldn't believe it. There's a book on Starkovitz about a Polish slave labor camp, and she's in it, and there were only 2 babies that were born in Starkovitz. And what they did was they just took the baby away from her and murdered the baby right there and then. Well, soon after, the Germans, they closed the munitions factory, and they sent everybody on a death march to Auschwitz. You probably recognize this. So, of course, those that couldn't walk or they were slow, they were shot along the way, and Auschwitz, it was just like a very big city. It was divided into 3 camps and many sub-camps. And my father and my uncle, they were slaves at the Buda Monowitz factory, which was Auschwitz III, doing really backbreaking work for IG Farben, IG Farben produced synthetic rubber. From synthetic rubber, they made coal. And two of the, I'm just showing you some pictures of Auschwitz. And 2 of the slaves working alongside my father and my uncle were Elie Wiesel, who wrote Night, I'm sure you've heard of him, and also Primo Levi. And many German industries, they built factories in Auschwitz in order to profit, from the slave labor. so many, such as Kropp, Stabler, Benz, Bayer, Aspirin, well, it wasn't just Aspirin, Siemens Corporation. I'm just naming you a few. I could go on. And these are, if you were lucky enough to be able to get a seat on the toilet. And this is just 3 months ago when I took my children. We also went to Auschwitz, and my son and my daughter just by the train. There's a book out now that I purchased. It's called Nazi Billionaires, and it tells you about a lot of the families which you will recognize today that became multi-billionaires because of the war, because they had, they had the factories around Auschwitz, and so they profited greatly, as well as taking away all of the Jews' businesses. So my aunt, she was sent to Birkenau, and that was the death camp division of Auschwitz. And her work was, she just had the most horrible work because, well, thank God she wasn't killed because Birkenau was where they murdered you, but her work was hauling dead bodies out of the gas chambers into the crematoriums. And then, now it's Holocaust Remembrance Day, so that's when the Russians approached. But 10 days earlier, would you believe, what the Germans did was they tried to get their people that they thought were healthy back into Germany, and for forced labor. So SS units, they forced their healthy prisoners back into Germany, again, to be used for slave labor. So actually it's very interesting because I have the records, can't show them to you, but I have them. But it was actually January the 18th, and today's the 27th. So it was 9 days earlier. In 1945, my father and my uncle, they were forced on a death march to Buchenwald, and that was in Germany. And then again, my aunt of blessed memory, she was sent to Bergen-Belsen. And at Bergen-Belsen, the death march there was horrible. And who marched with her also, who was there at the time, was Anne Frank. She was marched to Bergen-Belsen, and her sister. And actually, Anne Frank died in Bergen-Belsen just before the liberation. And we believe that the reason she died was she was protected in that attic where they lived, and then all of a sudden she's thrown into Auschwitz, and then going to Bergen-Belsen. She didn't have, she didn't have the germs in her to protect her, so she was murdered. But anyways, in Bergen-Belsen's corpses were just lined up everywhere. They were just high, and there was very, very little food. They had absolutely no water, and people again were just dying like flies. And then in the late spring of 1945, Buchenwald was liberated by the 89th Infantry Division American, and then my father, who was like a scarecrow, he made his way back to Up, because of course he didn't know that his wife and his family was dead, and he went to find them, but of course nobody was there. They were all dead. So then he started looking for me, and he eventually he went to the Repelovskas, and he went to one convent and the second one, but the nuns didn't want to give me up because I was a perfect little Catholic girl, and on top of that, they certainly didn't know that I was Jewish, and they told him that and it was true. They told him that they had absolutely no Jewish children there, and they never had had Jewish children. But he persisted that he needed to come in to find me, and the nuns were sort of afraid of my father making a ruckus, because he'd bring the Russians around. Russia had liberated Poland, and at that time they were very, very sympathetic to the survivors, but not to Poles. So they let him in to shut him up, and what they did was they lined up all their little girls with their backs to him, like this. And our faces were to the wall, and they told him that if he could pick me out, he could have me. Well, you have to remember, first of all, he hadn't seen me since I was a year and 9 months old, and now I'm 5 years old. But he kept looking at little girls' legs, and luckily I was born with a huge mole on the inside of my left leg, and would you believe that's how he recognized me? Oh, wait a second. Okay. So then, I mean, they really didn't want to give me up, because to them I was just a lovely Polish child. So they told him that he would have to pay them 500 zlotys for my keep. You know, they fed me and all that before they released me, figuring that would keep him away, because he had nothing. He looked like a cadaver. He'd gone through years of unspeakable horror. So then he had no choice. He left and he went back to Abt. Excuse me. So by this time, a whole bunch of agencies set up help centers for the refugees. One of them was the American Red Cross and other agencies. And one could hopefully find if a loved one was alive, or other kinds of help. See, they didn't have computers, or there was lists that were made of people, and every single day you went to look at the list to see who was alive. But anyways, and other kinds of help, anyhow. So this is in Polish. It's my father's writing, and when he wrote it, my dad's signature, begging for 5,000 zlotys to get me out of the convent. Here, this is the English translation you can read. So he somehow got his 5,000 zlotys, and after the money exchange, and you know, they didn't have a choice and they had to give me back. But I took one look at my father when they brought me out, and I was just totally hysterical. I can't pinpoint how it happened. I have absolutely no idea, but that I felt this way. But I believe that Jews were very evil, that they sucked the blood out of children, and I had heard horrible tales about Jews. I can't even tell you where or what. And I really was such an avid Christian, but I had also become just a, would you believe, a ferocious Jew hater. And here this Jew is trying to take me with him. But I had absolutely no choice. He takes me to Lodz. That's another large city in Poland, and there he had found two of his sisters, his younger sisters, alive. They were in a minor slave labor camp. And all of us lived together, and I had this huge distended stomach from malnutrition and tons of lice in my hair. But every single night I would go into a corridor of the room, and I crossed myself and I prayed to Jesus. And to say the least, my family was not happy with me, because if you think about it, here they lost most of their loved ones and all their possessions and their flesh and blood as a fervent anti-Semite. But then soon they realized that we were not safe in Poland, because anti-Semitism was just rampant. And and there were rumors about the old blood libel, that we were kidnapping Christian children, draining their blood, and pogroms started, and Polish vigilante groups, they were beating up and sometimes even killing the Jews coming back from concentration camps and from force and from hiding. And then on top of that, the Poles feared that we were coming back to take back our possessions, and they didn't want to give them back to us. So in the middle of the night, we fled Poland. But if you could just imagine, you know, after such horrific times, and you come back to your country, and you treat it this way, it's just mind-boggling to me today. Anyways, we eventually made our way into Birtanadona, that's in Bavaria. And don't forget that southern Germany had been liberated by the United States. That's why we ran there. And we reunited with my aunt and uncle that had been with my father. And what the American Army had done was they had thrown out a bunch of very high-ranking Germans out of their huge homes. And there were like 10 houses all in a row. And they set up a DP camp, which is displaced person camp, for you that don't know what that is, for us homeless. And a lot of us lived in each house, and we all shared the living room and the kitchen and the bathroom. And my father and I, we shared a room, but he really, what can I say, he was shell-shocked, and he was just in his own misery, lost in it, and he was just doing his own thing. And I just wandered amongst the refugees, which was great because they were like family. And this is funny, but when we went into town, we always went in groups because the local German people weren't exactly thrilled to see us there. And my gosh, if I saw a church, I would run away from the people that I was with, and I'd run in and pray. And or if I saw a nun on the street, let me tell you, I would just run after her and get down on my knees and try to kiss the bottom of her veil. And anyways, I was the only young Jewish child in that whole DP camp. You could see me, the little thing there, and all those people, they're all survivors. Everybody's survivors. They always put me at the head of a parade. I was the only one. I mean, afterwards they started having the babies, what have you, but there wasn't a young child like that. To them, I was a reaffirmation of life. And this was, that's an Israeli flag, which you can't see, that man is holding. And we are celebrating, it was 1948, the creation of the State of Israel. I can't even tell you what an incredible thing that was for us. And I just want you to try to imagine how horrible it was for us, because we had no home to go back to. Unlike, you know, all the soldiers from the wars and also survivors from other countries. The other countries weren't like Poland. And we had no belongings, we had no birth certificates, no papers of any kind, no money. And of course, most of our family was decimated, and we're all trying to get out of Europe, but guess what? No country wanted us. So we lived in Germany for 3 years. And it was very difficult to get into the United States because of quotas. They were very popular, gobbled up. But eventually, after 3 years, we got a visa to Canada. And so I was 8.5 by the time when we got to Toronto. Would you believe that I was put into kindergarten? And that was awful, but I was completely illiterate. I didn't know a word of English, and had not had a day of school except for the Bible, and they didn't have translators back then for children. Certainly not in Canada. I don't know if in the United States. And here I spoke 3 other languages and had gone through 3 name changes. but not English was not one of them. And I was like a little animal because I was constantly hungry. Even though by this time we had food, but my father wasn't able to look after me because he had to go earn a living. So I was put into a bunch of foster homes, and that didn't work out. And eventually, thankfully, my aunt and uncle that was with my father and gone through the war with him, they took me in. So, do we still have a few minutes? Just a few minutes, thank you very much. So several years ago, I just want to tell you, I hired an investigator in Poland to try to piece my lost childhood together. Heck, I never had a childhood, I wanted it. So in the Ronald Lauder Jewish Archives in Warsaw, he found the letter that my father had written begging for money in order for the 5,000 zlotys. And then the investigator also, he left inquiries at the convents and all over on me for people to contact him. So anyhow, the carriage driver, Jan, he stopped by the convent every so often when he was driving by, and he saw the inquiry, and he was so shocked that I was alive, and he immediately called my investigator, and then I spoke to him after that myself, and I asked him so many questions, like he told me that he picked me up from up, and of course I asked him, what about my parents who took me over? And he told me that my mother stood back crying, and then he told me about the Repolevskas, and he told me about leaving me in the ditch. I even have it on tape, and I was screaming and crying. And then an older girl, 8 years older than me, her mother had been the cook for the convent, and she kept in touch with them and was told about me, and she remembered me very well, and she was the one that sent a picture of me in the convent. Look how lucky I am. So I called her, and several times I recaptured a lot there, and then I met with a nun who was a novice back then, and that was really, really wonderful. Now, best of all, I took my 3 children to Poland. That was just before I turned 70, so a long time ago. To pass on my life to them, it was very important to me. So I hired a Polish guy to go with us. And would you believe he found the city councilman from up to help us? Just show you this. Yeah. So here I am. This is like a bunch of years ago. So we made them open up their books to us, and sure enough, my birth was actually registered in this old book there. So at the age of 70, I found out my real birth date. By the way, I am 8 months younger than my father said. Weird, and I can't even use it because when I go for Social Security, anything, my driver's license, everything is the age that my father gave, which was May 20th, 1940. But heck, I think he was thinking of when he got married. So, and then on top of that, I found out my real name. I'm not Marion. My name is Miriam. You can see it on my birth certificate that the Poles gave me after they wrote it down, what was in the actual book. Miriam, I love that name. I wish that I had it now. And I certainly never knew that. I was always called Maya. And then I also found the record of my parents' marriage here. My father's signature there is small, and that's the signature of my mother at the bottom there. And it is the only thing that I own of her. I can't tell you how thrilling that was to me. I think probably that is probably the most wonderful thing I've ever gotten she was real, she was here, she actually signed something. So I just want to leave you with a few thoughts, and that is to please be vigilant and proactive of this really, really wonderful country. And I want you to remember that Germany was a democracy before Hitler came to power. So we must speak up when we see or hear signs of discrimination, and that's coming both from the left and right, because anti-Semitism does not have a party. The Germans would never have been able to murder over 6 million Jews if they had had an outcry from the public against it. So I beg you to educate your peers and don't let hatred take root. And now I entrust you with the responsibility of continuing to pass on to others what you have learned from me today. Thank you.
At this time, I'd like to invite the sisters of St. Cecilia to come up for a picture.
Oh my God. I'm still in awe of anyone that I see. It's a sister.
We would now like to invite our Jewish students to the stage to lead a prayer for peace. We will first say the prayer in Hebrew, and then we invite you all to join us in saying the prayer in English. Copies of the prayer are under your seat. Please stand. Shalom, Tova, Ubracha, Hein v'Hesed v'Rachamim, Aleinu v'Chol Yisrael, Amecha. Barheinu Avinu Kulanu Ke'echad Be'or Panecha. Ki Be'or Panecha Natata Lanu, Adonai Eloheinu, Torat Chaim ve'Ahavat Chesed. Ustaka Ubracha v'Rachamim, v'Chaim v'Shalom. V'tov Peinecha levarech et Amha Yisrael b'chol ed u'chol sha'a b'shomecha. Baruch atah Adonai, oseh ha'shalom. Okay, together. Grant us peace, your most precious gift, O eternal source of peace, and enable our people Israel to be its messengers to all the world. Bless our country that it may ever be of peace, and its advocate in the Council of Nations. May contentment reign within our borders, health and happiness within our homes. Strengthen the bonds of friendship and harmony among the inhabitants of all lands. Plant virtue in every soul, and may our love for you hallow every home and every heart. We praise you, O God, giver of peace. Please be seated. We are so grateful to spend time with the student body talking about such an important matter today. Ms. Weinzweig, thank you again for spending your morning enlightening us with your powerful story. We have a small gift to show our appreciation.
Before that, can I just say that I want to thank you. It's just been such a pleasure being with you. Thank you so much. And I'm looking at the nuns.